Do you think there's an alienation between the government on the one hand and its stakeholders?
Definitely. So I think this budget, much of what the government is doing is really serving the interests of a small elite in Colombo and maybe the other towns. But they really have abandoned the people. And then of course they are pandering to the interests of maybe commercial interests abroad, and particularly because we defaulted on our debt last year, the creditors, right? So they're bending over backwards to serve the interests of creditors, particularly bondholders. But in terms of, so even if you look at this budget, the government has been very critical of what they call money printing, which really means expanding government debt. But the president has come out and said that they are going to increase the debt ceiling by something like 3.5 trillion rupees, just so that they can repay the creditors. So that is also money printing. So they're happy to do money printing to serve the creditors, but they're not willing to do anything to support the people, to provide them relief, and to find a transition out of this very deep crisis. Otherwise, we stand the risk of losing a generation. This is going to be a very long, protracted crisis. If you look at the IMF program, which we are locked into, they are saying, next year, even the government has said we would only have 1.6% growth. Now, even that is questionable. Even the IMF program over the next 4 years, and after that, they're only looking at about 3% growth per year. That is very minimal for a developing country. On the other hand, the IMF says allocate 4.5% worth of your GDP for debt repayment, right? So we're only going to grow 3%, but we are going to be spending 4.5%, which is about 30% of our budget, to repay debt. So the government is not bargaining with the IMF. The government is not negotiating hard enough with the creditors to be able to put our economy on a sustainable path. They are just putting the entire burden on the working people. You would have heard about domestic debt restructuring a few months ago. And what did they do? They have cut the retirement funds of our working people, right? My estimates are that in 16 years' time, the retirement funds of working people, let's say they are 40 years now old and they're going to retire in 16 years' time, their retirement fund is going to decline by 47%. What will they have for their retirement, right? So this government is not sensitive, not sympathetic at all to what the people are facing, and they're only concerned about what they're calling investor-friendly policies, right? And whether actually investors would come is a big question, because Sri Lanka is in such a deep crisis, right? They are continuing in this sort of mythical belief that somehow investors are going to come and save Sri Lanka. When this hasn't happened over the last 2 decades, would investors come during a deep crisis like this? We have to first put our house in order, right? To get people to a level that they can survive. But that kind of thinking is not there with the government and not there with the IMF, because the IMF represents the interests of very powerful actors abroad and commercial interests abroad.